Hello everyone, welcome back to History 101. In this lecture, we will be looking at the Reformation. You read about it, and hopefully you either did the quiz or are going to do the quiz on the chapter. And like all my lectures, right, I want to add a little bit more context and hopefully try to provide some structure to this event, contextualize it within this vast period that we call the Middle Ages, and address some of the key reasons why the Reformation took place. So prior to the 16th century, you really only have one church that, particularly in Western Europe, that controls the majority of society. And this one church is kind of like the unifying identity of Western Europe, whether you're from what we now know today as France, England, Germany, Italy, Spain. This one concept of Christianity connected all these people together, but it's a very Catholic form of Christianity. By the 16th century, that begins to change. So in this lecture, I titled it The Remission of Sins, Indulgences, the Church, and by church we mean the Catholic Church, and look at its inability to reform, right? So had it been open to some of the things that critiques have been making about the Catholic Church, it probably would have continued, and most places would have continued to be Catholic. However, its inability to take that critique forced a break in the Catholic Church, a schism, if you will. So let's look at the Reformation. So the objectives for today is, number one, we're going to address how heresy brought down the Catholic Church. And by heresy, basically, is the idea of ideas that the Catholic Church does not agree with about their faith, right? So a lot of these heresies are based off maybe biblical texts that the church might not agree with their interpretation of it. So the church begins to attack them. And I'll talk about different heresies, not only during the Reformation, but also before, because heresy was nothing new. Since the inception of the Catholic Church, there had always been critique. So the church was trying to keep these groups down. Number two, we're going to explain how technology became a revolutionary tool. And the main focus for this lecture, the book talks about this too, but the main focus will be the printing press and the role that it played in allowing the critique to flourish throughout Europe. Prior to this period, one of the biggest questions that we have is why was the Reformation successful while others that came before it were not? And some of these groups or people made some of the same critiques that Martin Luther was making. So why was he successful and these other movements that happened in the 12th, 13th century were not? So we're going to look at how technology played an instrumental role in reforming or breaking from the church. And then lastly, I don't want to get preachy with you because this isn't the intent of this class, right? Not to say that one faith is better than the other or anything like that. We're looking at the history of it, how these things came about, and we're going to see that as good critique as Luther had, this movement also becomes political. So eventually, it takes, particularly as more people get involved, it takes a life onto its own. So we're going to see how politics played a role in the spread of the Reformation, where groups are actually taking sides. Those who are supporting the people like Luther and those type of reformers, while others, particularly kings here, are supporting the Catholic Church, places like Spain and obviously the Papal States. So let's begin. So we begin by looking at this concept of remission of sins. So we're going to go back to the Middle Ages. Again, everything goes back to the Middle Ages. And we're going to see how this idea where a pope basically forgives people of their sins play an important role in the Reformation. Now, it's not the only reason why we have the Reformation, but it is a key one. All right, and the book talks a little bit about this too. So as you are all well aware, throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had a monopoly on religious faith in Western Europe. which meant that there was really not much one could do to challenge its authority. And as we have meticulously exhausted, Catholicism united a very fractured terrain with multiple kingdoms. Again, what made everybody connected during this period, during the Middle Ages, is Catholicism, right? There's this faith. However, throughout the High and Late Middle Ages, we begin to see fissures as individuals, along with communities, challenge the church's authority, with little success, yet setting the foundation for what would become the Reformation. During the Middle Ages, all avenues of life, along with death, needed to go through the church. So there really was no escaping the Catholic Church. As the reading highlighted, during the Crusades, the church was the leading forces in recruiting people to fight for their cause in order to aid Constantinople. By providing a quote-unquote remission of sins, the earthly misdeeds of individuals would be forgiven. Such action would catapult the church into a collision course with those who sought to reform the church. So critiquing the Catholic Church was nothing new, not even for the Middle Ages, which, truth be told, have been happening since its inception. So we can go even further back, right? For example, the Cathars, those French people who believed that all flesh was sinful, therefore living a life of self-denial, vegetarianism, and a simple way of life, along with rejecting the hierarchy of the Western Church and rejecting the Eucharist, the baptism, and church rites. Those Cathars were quickly put down by Innocent III, declaring Catharism as heresy by calling a crusade on them. From June 1209 to 1211, Simon de Montfort began an onslaught of torture, burning, and murdering all of suspected Cathars, thus slaughtering thousands. Though Montfort eventually died due to a rock that was catapulted during the besieging of Toulouse, the mantle was picked up by Louis the Lion all the way into the 1220s. Though Catharism continued well into the 14th century, it did show that the Catholic Church's hegemony would not be challenged. So more or less, they were able to put this heretic movement down. Another heresy that you are familiar with is the Lollards. This is from your textbook, which was led by Yorkshire theologian John Wycliffe. As you may recall, education and universities took off in the High Middle Ages. So around the year 1000 to about 1300, universities really took off, right? These places of study. And Wycliffe was a byproduct of this intellectual movement that didn't seek to question the Catholic Church, but rather sought answers to questions that attempted to tie the intellectual world with a spiritual one, in order to have a better understanding of God and faith. In the 1370s, Wycliffe was an intellectual that dabbled a bit in politics, so it was no surprise that he found himself in this controversy with the church. In fact, he proposed many radical ideas and even translated portions of the Bible into the vernacular. Recall that all church literature at this time was in Church Latin, making it, Wycliffe making it in the vernacular, making it accessible to the masses, or at least those that could read. Some of his most controversial theories were that there was no legitimacy to the papacy because it was not grounded on biblical texts, that transubstantiation was nothing but nonsense, and that political states could reclaim church territory. Wycliffe, who was protected by powerful nobles, was allowed to continue his critique, but when the peasants' revolt erupted in England, Wycliffe was blamed for stirring up the spirits that set this revolt in motion. By the 1380s, his career was essentially over, and he died by 1384. However, he was not forgotten because in the 15th century, the church exhumed his bones and burned them, declaring that all his works were heresy. His actions, though limited in actual reform, would set another movement. the Lollardy along with Jan Hus, which is instrumental in addressing this story of the Reformation. Recall that the Black Death, along with the Great Schism of the 14th century, had a major negative impact on the Catholic Church. Many scholars continue their critique of the Church, such as the friar William Occam. So you might be familiar with Occam, with this concept of Occam's razor, right? This notion that the most logical answer is probably the true answer. So Occam had said, quote, "No one is bound to believe the Pope in matters which are of faith, unless he can demonstrate the reasonableness of what he says to be the rule of faith," unquote. Basically, he is saying that if it is not in the Bible, that if it's in the Bible, then people can abide by it. Though his comments was a major theological blow, others would take it much further. In an earlier lecture, I mentioned the trial of Jan Hus when discussing the story of Pope Joan, where he, Hus, also questioned the lineage and legitimacy of the papacy. Well, in the early 15th century, he, or someone very close to him, produced the Latin polemic known as the Anatomy of the Antichrist, which described the Pope as the devil. After this, in 1415, Hus was burned at the stake and his supporters were killed. Though you might think that this is no big deal since there was a long history of the church going after its enemies, it is a significant turning point. First, we have to ask, why were these movements not successful like the later Reformation? Second, how did the Black Death, along with other social political events of the 14th and 15th century, help spur in this age of reform? And lastly, why was the church unable to limit these movements when it was the unifying power throughout Europe? First, we have to go back to the Crusades and the remission of sins. Right, back to where this lecture kind of started. It is indicative to note that many of these reformers questioned many aspects of the church. However, to keep it simple for you all, I'm only going to focus on the selling of indulgences. As you recall, Pope Urban II gave crusaders the quote-unquote remission of sins if they would participate in the Crusades. And this idea of remission of sins can actually go back to Spain to 1063, where Pope Alexander II supported the Christians against the Muslims in Spain. As the decades wore on, the idea of indulgences took a life of its own, particularly with the development of purgatory. Around the 1160s to about 1180s, this concept of purgatory pretty much more or less comes about. If you ever read Dante's Inferno, you probably are familiar with this. So purgatory, for those of you that might not be familiar with it, it's this in-between state of the soul after death. So it's caught in this, the soul is caught in this in-between state before it reaches heaven. So you got to serve some time basically in purgatory. For those that did not go on crusade, there was a way for them to buy their way into heaven, and the church used all its theological muscle to construct an argument to legitimize this practice that by 1343, Pope Clement VI confirmed that, quote, "the merits of Christ are a treasure of indulgences," unquote. And indulgences became very important a few years later when the Black Death devastated Europe. According to critics, this action seemed to be the last straw that pushed the church from an institution of faith to one that became, quote unquote, the whore of Babylon. In fact, Jan Hus argued, quote, "one pays for confession, for mass, for the sacraments, for indulgences, for churching a woman," and this is when a woman is welcomed back to the congregation after giving birth, "for a blessing, for burial, for funeral services and prayers. The very last penny which an old woman has hidden in her bundle for fear of thieves or robbery will not be saved. The villainous priest will grab it," unquote. What one sees is that the church had their hands in people's pockets from birth until the afterlife. In fact, by the 1470s, Pope Sixtus IV allowed indulgences to be bought on behalf of the dead. which in other words means you could buy for your dead relative, which the church called intercessions, since it was believed that the dead relative was in purgatory, so someone needed to bail them out. Though we would like to believe that such action was obvious to the medieval person as a form of money grab, we must remember the context of the society. As you recall, the Catholic Church wrapped itself in the lives of people from birth to death. So Christianity was interwoven into the very fabric of society. Many of us today would like to think that we would not be so gullible to believe such superstition. However, in our own culture, we see people doing money grabs, right? You are very, I'm sure you can think of examples from influencers and stuff like that. So it's important to note that medieval people wanted to go to heaven. This is an idea that's real to them, right? Particularly in a time where the Black Death, along with other diseases and warfare, could wipe out populations in the blink of an eye, thus making the purchase of an indulgence somewhat of an insurance policy for the unforeseen future and the afterlife. Let's look at the printing press now. So, as you can see, the remission of sins for cash, along with people questioning the church, set the tone for what would take place in the 16th century with the Reformation. However, before I talk about Luther, I want to highlight the role that the printing press had, which was more than just printing Bibles. Most of the time, when we talk about the printing press, it's always within that context that they started printing Bibles that were in the vernacular and people started reading it and started questioning the church. There's more to the story. The reading in the previous chapter emphasized the importance of the press, particularly for making the Bible and classical texts accessible. It also noted that printing became one of the largest industries in Europe because it allowed and, quote, encouraged the development of scholarly research and the desire to attain knowledge, unquote. As you are well aware, any modern technology has both positive and negatives, and just like the internet, which was supposed to revolutionize our culture for the better in the 1990s, we can also see how this technology causes the devolution of society, such as the internet, particularly today with so much QAnon and misinformation out there, and sometimes people believe the internet more than logic and reason. So the printing press is no different. Indeed, Gutenberg's Bible was the first significant text printed using this new technology, so much so that we often mention this fact and forget the rest of the story. Many are not aware that Gutenberg was sued by a goldsmith named Johann Fuss, because Gutenberg had not paid his debt, which was money he borrowed to produce this new machine. Fuss was determined to get his investment, so either Gutenberg was going to pay him back or Fuss would take what he felt was rightfully his, which were the printing presses, Gutenberg's letter types, and basically his workshop. So around 1456, as Gutenberg was finishing his Bible, Fuss, along with Gutenberg's apprentice Peter Schoeffer, took over the Bible project and published it. So how does all this contribute to the development and the successful challenge of the Catholic Church? Well, we must examine how the printing press was used for much more than just printing Bibles. So now we're going to talk about this document right here. Historian Dan Jones noted that the first surviving Western document to have been printed with a movable tie press is not the Bible or any other sort of book, but rather a document known as a quote-unquote papal letter of indulgence, which was printed in October 1454, before the Bible. This one document was printed many times over and repeated the same verses with the exception of names, dates, and signatures. Though to many this might seem as just a curiosity, the significance is telling as it directly links to the cause of the Reformation as this document played an important role for the church to collect money in order to fight against the Ottomans. Many people, quote unquote, bought their get out of purgatory letter, and as long as it was handed to their confessor before their passing, they were set to enter the pearly gates. The significance of this document then is that the church could mass produce them, no longer having to handwrite each one, and with the printing presses opening all over Europe, we see a mass market for them. In fact, printing runs for these indulgence letters ran from about 5,000 to 20,000 copies at a time, allowing the church to fundraise to help pay for churches or provide funds for monasteries. We must also remember, as stated earlier, that medieval people sought them out since death was something to fear. Thus, in the end, the church was just providing a service. By the latter part of the 1400s, the printing and selling of indulgences had become part of the very religious culture all throughout Europe, so it would take decades before it came into question. In fact, Pope Sixtus IV, who was in desperate need of funds to build castles across the papal state in order to defend against the Ottomans, legitimized this practice and collected a few extra funds to complete some special projects in Rome and in the Vatican. Pope Leo X continued the practice when he wanted to remodel St. Peter's Basilica, which turned out to be a very costly move, as we will see. And there you see a picture of Pope Leo X. So now let's look at Luther and how the printing press and Luther and some of these political matters all kind of tie in together. As you read, the 95 Theses completely transformed Western Europe as Luther sought to question the justification of the selling of indulgences, along with other critiques as you see in these 95 Theses. This is one of the earliest copies that we have, and again, this was done in the printing press. So there was a lot of critique in these 95 Theses. The printing press, again, became an important tool of mass communication, as his 95 Theses were printed and sent to important institutions and church leaders, such as the oldest surviving copy of it being sent to Albert, Archbishop of Mainz. Quickly, this document went quote-unquote viral, and it was no longer an open question for debate, but rather a revolution of the soul as copies traveled throughout Germany, to England, to France, and even Italy. For Luther, and along with many other people, Pope Leo X was a product of a corrupt institution. In fact, Pope Leo was a Medici who grew up in the lap of luxury and was wealthier than any other pope in history. Thus, Luther argued, quote, "Why does not the pope, whose wealth is today greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build this one basilica of St. Peter with his own money, rather than that of the poor believers," unquote. For his action, this made Luther a wanted man. And when he went to give a lecture at the University of Leipzig in 1519, he uttered the words that made him a target. He argued that papal authority held no weight on matters of scripture, and in a wise guy dig, he said that Jan Hus was, quote, "a good Christian," unquote. Remember that the Catholic Church had condemned Hus. With this, we see the final straw. And as Pope Leo officially condemned Luther in a papal bull called Exsurge Domine, Arise, O Lord, people now had to take sides, and we see some of the big political players jump into the debate. For example, the man that has been associated with the break with the papacy in England, Henry VIII, called Luther, quote, an infernal wolf, unquote, and a, quote, a great member of the devil, unquote, blaming him for bringing up, quote, heresies which ought to lie in eternal darkness, unquote. In fact, Henry wrote a book called Assertio, because he always fancied himself as a great writer and a great scholar. And in this book, he printed and sent a caravan to give to the Pope, hoping to gain favor with him and eager that the Pope would bestow a title fitting a man of his stature. Pope Leo read the book and was so moved that he gave Henry the title of Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith. Another key figure was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who promised the Pope to go after Luther. As Luther was on the run and safe under the protection of Frederick of Saxony, Luther began his work to challenge the sacred institution of the Catholic Church, such as deconstructing the basis for the monastic vows, forced public confession, and even the Mass, so nothing was off limits to him. He worked on translating the New Testament into German. He wrote hymns and contemplated ways to force European Jews to convert to Christianity. Essentially, he was building a new church without fully intending to. As you read in the chapter, many other people took his idea and ran with them, taking things further than Luther ever intended to. After all, Luther was a reformer, which meant that he wanted to tweak things, not destroy them. However, it was now too late, and when the Peasants' War of 1525 sought his support, he tried to put the genie back in the bottle. Though the Peasants' War mimicked much of his same critiques that he had, Luther tried to distance himself from them when he wrote Admonition of Peace, asking the rebels to negotiate for better conditions. When that failed to convince them, he took a much harsher position, writing against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants, where he scolded their actions and essentially sided with the nobles as they slaughtered tens of thousands of peasants for no other reason than following some of the same ideals that Luther preached. You have to understand that Luther needed the support of the nobles, which is why he sided with them. As you are now aware, and as it is painstakingly clear, Luther shifted from a reformer to a partisan leader, as the Reformation had taken a life of its own, and new religious reformers would construct new Christian faiths that used the foundation of Luther's ideas, but would push the boundaries of what was acceptable. The Reformation now became a political tool to be used by kings to gain land and challenge the papacy. For example, we saw Charles V take Rome in May of 1527, and though Henry VIII was a strong supporter of the Catholic Church, as previously noted, the lack of the Pope's blessing for his divorce from Catherine, who was the aunt of Charles V, he now changed his course and divorced England from the papacy. In the end, Luther won the battle. However, the Pandora's box that he opened created more conflicts for the next 100 years. So in this lecture, what do we learn? So hopefully you walk away with a basic understanding of how the Catholic Church tried to put down heretic movements, but they were always there, but we see Luther being successful, right? So in this lecture, one of the key points that I want you to take away with is this notion of the role that technology plays. And we see it in every generation, right? In almost any period. But in this one in particular, we see how the printing press made Luther's movement successful where others had failed. And I really believe that the printing press was instrumental in making his movement successful. We see that medieval education helped challenge the institution that helped create it. This is the irony of things, right? It's the Catholic Church who created universities where people went to go study and learn and read and learn philosophy and so forth, right? And obviously read the Bible. And it's through this process that different groups or different individuals begin to question the very institution that created these universities, right? So they begin to question the Catholic Church. So it's very, very ironic to some extent, right? And then number three, though it was a religious reform movement, the Reformation, it eventually got tied up with politics, as I try to stress towards the end of the lecture, right? Luther was sincere about his critique of the Catholic Church. But at the same time, this movement became very political as it got really out of his hands, and he needed the support of different people. So, particularly with the Peasants' War, you would think that he would have supported them, since many of these people kind of agreed with him. And eventually, it becomes very political. So, something that started off as a reform movement, completely transformed the 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 religions throughout Western Europe. So I quickly want to end with a works cited page. I want you to know that all this stuff comes from academic sources. Many of these things are coming from sources that are accessible to you. So I put down a few articles that I used. And then if you love medieval history, I think this is one of the best books I've read. It's by Dan Jones, Power and Thrones. A New History of the Middle Ages, which is he's a great storyteller of history, and it makes it as a real kind of easy read. All right, so we'll end it there, and I hope you feel like you learned about the Reformation. Have a good day.